Thank you to all of our panelists for a really stimulating hour. The next thing up is to invite our panelists to have some interaction with each other about their presentations. And I'd like to just share a couple of the questions and points that the AIM group shared with our speakers just as a prompt, and then let them interact with each other for about 30 minutes. We are interested in learning from them and eventually from you all as well about how to connect the dots, ways to broaden and deepen our relationships and sharpen our praxis in working for a just peace. We want to know from each of you what's in your organizer activist toolkit. What are the methods that you're excited about? BDS has already been mentioned, but let's talk a little bit about that as well. We also want to try to overcome the silo effect where we each kind of work within our own struggles and try to find ways to connect the dots, work together. So any concrete suggestions you have about that is helpful to all of us. And we all have limitations on our time and energy, so how can we amplify a collective voice to sharpen public debate around these questions? So these are a couple of the things that we've been wrestling with, and we're so grateful for your wisdom on these things. Would like to hear more. So let me just, with that, throw it open to you all to interact with each other for about 30 minutes in what you heard from one another. Anybody want to?
Mike's close to you. So.
Well, I would just, in terms of activism and so on, because we only had so much time to talk about a number of things. I did mention BDS, and I do want to expand on that just a little bit. And one of the reasons why I think BDS is so important and so useful when we're talking about tools in the activist toolkit. I assume many of you are familiar, but BDS is obviously boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction the state of Israel in the hopes of changing Israeli state behavior towards Palestinians and their rights. And there's often this debate about BDS, about really how successful is it, how successful can it be, how much of an impact can it have, and so on. But one thing that I think is very important and often overlooked when it comes to the usefulness of BDS is the power that the tool has in really educating people and creating space for conversations about this issue in places where they never would have existed before. For example, recently there was a church convention in Detroit that many of you may have heard of. They considered BDS resolutions to be passed in their conference and so on. But here you had, a mainline American church in Detroit, Michigan, who was in heated debate about what's going on in Palestine. How in the world would that have happened if it was not for BDS? It wouldn't have happened. And just by virtue of the fact that those conversations were going on, there's a whole new set of institutions, a whole new set of communities that are having these conversations, becoming educated about an issue that 10 years ago they would not have been. They could not have been, because this movement provides a platform for that to happen, provides a space for that to happen. And that's not just happening in Detroit, right? BDS campaigns are happening all around the world. So that is a starting place for those conversations to grow and take off and to become something else. So I could not, support BDS more for what it offers and the potential that it has to actually kind of create the change that we'd like to see.
You want this one?
Or you go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of connecting the dots, I come from a generation, and perhaps many in this audience will recall this, that there was a time when national liberation movements did have a framework called internationalism. Yes, it was ideological, but it was basically, we are anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and many times anti-capitalist. And this was a powerful framework, I would say, in the 60s, 70s, and started losing its currency in the 80s. But it was a way in which communities of color, some of the more active militant communities of color within the United States did relate to each other. Unfortunately, we have lost some of that. We are now regaining those, connecting the dots when it comes to over-incarceration, when it comes to police profiling, when it comes to housing foreclosures. So a lot of these bread and butter issues are beginning to bring us together. So I have faith in that. The issue that I have is that when you have limited resources, and many community organizations are understaffed and underfunded and are basically on survival and reaction mode, how do you bring up an issue of Palestine, half the world away, and you are also dealing with issues of survival? It's very difficult, which is why in my toolkit, I have this PowerPoint presentation, which, yes, it's dated, it's limited, but it serves the purpose of beginning the conversation. And one of the things that I do on campuses, and since this is the research triangle, you might want to think about this, is having these presentations co-sponsored by either Arab and Muslim Student Association and the Latino Student Association networks. And then it'll take off from there. And that's one way to go about doing it. But again, I'm up against like these behemoth organizations that are funding leaders of the Latino community and the immigrant rights community to go to Israel. And even if they get the occupation, sometimes they come back and are like neutralized because they know when certain individuals sits on funding boards and they criticize Israel openly, that will come back and bite them in the rear end. So these are difficult challenges that at least my activism around Palestine has been hitting up against.
Yusuf mentioned the Presbyterian GA in Detroit, and that for me, I was there. I know there's some people in the room who were there with us as well. That for me was a very important turning point in my own understanding of this movement, because I think particularly in faith-based organizing, we have common values that we can stress. And what's interesting to me is I was there with a delegation from Jewish Voice for Peace. I was there very publicly as a Jew, and there were also Jews from the Jewish establishment organizations there as well, actively campaigning against the overture to divest from these three companies. And what was interesting to me is that I felt fully Jewish, but at the same time had more in common with my Christian brothers and sisters than I did with these Jews from the organized Jewish community. And what that led me to realize is that I think when we frame this issue as one of values and one of human rights as being one of the central values, we find that we have much more in common than simple ethnic allegiance. And I think that's one of the important tools in the faith-based toolkit for organizing, is that we need to stress our common values as no matter what religion we are. If we truly stand for human rights and the dignity of all people, and that that all people are bearers of God's image, and to stand up against the ethnocentric notion that there are certain people who are more worthy of rights than others, I think we find the movement can grow. I mean, I think that was what ended up tipping the scale in Detroit, and it only tipped slightly. It was only a few votes, but it made the difference. I think finding that interfaith solidarity that was deeply, deeply on a very sacred level, values-based, I think is very, very key. I have no illusions about the challenges within the organized Jewish community. I think what I'm finding increasingly is that it's a waste of energy to spend too much time trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced. I often hear this, when people take me to, members of the Jewish community take me to task for what they consider to be my strident tone. They'll say things like, you might be able to reach me if, dot, dot, dot. And I always respond, I'm not doing this to convince you. I'm part of a movement that's trying to leverage pressure to create real change. And you can be part of that movement or not, but I think the emphasis needs to be on building this movement and not changing hearts and minds. I think the more the movement grows, the more we see the inevitable results of Zionism, like we did this past summer. We're going to see more people understanding the importance of this movement far more than any rhetorical argument could ever make. I think as horrid and tragic as this summer was, in so many ways, we also have many, many more people who are jumping aboard the BDS movement and many of these organizations who are standing in solidarity with Palestinians. And I think that's an important piece of the toolkit as well, is concentrate on movement building and not getting stuck in pedagogy. I think then that's a unique problem in the Jewish community in particular.
Yeah, so on toolkits, in my toolkit will be Gabe's PowerPoint from now on. And he may want to use the video too, which again, I just want to Jasiri X is an important young person, and it's good. But about BDS and how important it is, just two examples, a small anecdotal one and then the larger question. A couple of months ago, there was a street festival in Raleigh, and they had people giving out samples, and they were giving out samples of Sabra hummus, right? So I stopped and engaged them in this conversation. Yeah, I know this is good, tastes good, and you're working here and whatnot, but let me tell you about Sabra, let me tell you about Israel, let me tell you about the Palestinian struggle. And the three people that were doing it who didn't work for Sabra, they worked for some company that was doing the work. Well, they said, well, that's interesting. We didn't know that, right? And this is important, and we're going to look into it a little bit more. So these just small encounters, but then there are the large encounters. You know, we come from a generation of the anti-apartheid struggle where the sanctions movement, the divestment movement was a key part of that struggle. And you reach a whole generation of students, many today who were the activists out here from our generation who took part in that. Now, we were clear it wasn't divestment or sanctions that won the struggle. It was the struggle on the ground in South Africa did it, as it will be the struggle on the ground in Palestine. But this is a component that we can participate in, and I think we have an obligation to actually do it with an understanding of its limitations and other things that need to be done, which leads me to kind of go to Gabe on this comparison between Mexico and Palestine, and drawing out the question of U.S. empire, the question of imperialism, and the question of capitalism, and not being afraid to deal with that, because this is not just a question of peace. You know, it gets framed that way. We just, you know, if we get the right people at the table, this thing will get straightened out, you know, or people of good hearts and minds. But it has a systemic basis to it. And how is it in this moment that we might use those examples to lift up these questions and to try to move things forward? Sorry, Gabe.
My PowerPoint did not get into the question of resources. However, immediately after 1848, the year 1849 happened, and that's when the gold rush happened in California. All those territories in the Southwest that the United States acquired through its aggressive war became the basis for industrializing in terms of the mineral wealth that was found in the Southwest. That conquering of territories made it possible for the United States to become a world economic power through the acquisition of all that mineral wealth and agricultural wealth. To this very day, California is seen as one of the breadbaskets of the United States. Such as in Palestine, at least in the Jordan Valley, the water wealth of the aquifers are practically prohibited to Palestinians from using, but are being used by the settlements and are quickly being drained. So the question of resources is also quite important.
Yeah, I never seen a mic that I was afraid of. So, you know, the organizers have asked about this question of silos. And, you know, people worry a lot about silos. Here's how I think about it. We've got to come together, the various liberation movements, the different sectors of it, the different sectors in our society. But there's something to be said for silos as well. And that is, in our community, we've got a big job ahead of us in the African American community. It's pretty clear based on some of the things that I mentioned. And so we've got to work on two levels. On one level, these kind of educational events, you know, solidarity work, rallies, those kinds of things. But there's got to be a determined effort in our own communities to really draw out these things, right? So don't worry. I don't think we should worry so much about that happening. But how can we help each other go deeper and deeper into our own communities? And so I would give one example during the last assault on Gaza, in a place you would never expect, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Right? People came together to protest what happened. A group called In the Name of Humanity, and I guess Sister Shafi had to leave. But in a small town like that, right, the African American community and the Arab and Palestinian and Muslim communities got together to speak out. And how did that happen? Because you had conscious political people, right, who said, we've got to reach out to the other community and find a way that we can come together to share with the broader Rocky Mount community our outrage at what has happened. So that goes on. And then there's the question of solidarity. I don't know, was Eduardo Galeno says that we don't want charity, we want solidarity. Well, inside of the solidarity is reciprocity. Okay, it's reciprocity. And so I think of another example, and that is the more recently formed Muslims for Social Justice, who are coming together and as a part of the broader social justice movement here in North Carolina, speaking out against racism, participating in HK-on-J and the Moral Monday movement, and becoming a part of that movement. So they add to our struggle, and we can add to their struggle. But it's reciprocity that's actually doing it. And so I just want to kind of lift up those two examples of good things that are happening in our community that I think we can build on.
Let me just read something from Ali Amunia's Battle for Justice in Palestine, and it hits right upon the point that Ajamu was talking about. This solidarity must be more than transactional, meaning we'll support your cause if you support ours arrangement, but must be founded on a deep analysis that the political forces, power centers, and white supremacist ideologies that advance racist laws and practice in such states as Arizona are the same ones that support and sponsor Israel and propagate the rhetoric and global violence of the war on terror. So I think that's part of what you were saying.
The issue of silos is one I think a lot about too. I mean, we all have our silos. We're all part of communities. At the same time, I think we have to have a realistic analysis of the reality within our communities. And I think the Jewish community is obviously in a different place vis-a-vis the relationship to Israel. But I have found that especially after a summer like this, we see whole parts of our community that are finding their voice that are very separate from the official parts of our community, the Jewish institutional establishment, which is pretty dead set in lockstep in support of Israel. And yet, we saw lots of grassroots, in addition to Jewish Voice of Peace, there have been many grassroots efforts on the ground of Jews coming together as Jews to protest. There was a young student group called If Not Now When that was protesting in front of Jewish Federation buildings and Jewish institutions all across the country. Particularly young people who are finding the doors closed in the official Jewish community, but want to be able to, as Jews, express their very strong point of view. So I think within our silo, I think we need to be very clear about what are the the parts that we want to spend time on working with, and what are the parts that are really, when all is said and done, are not really going to change and will only be impediments. That's what I mean. I don't talk about giving up on my community, but I think it's very important to recognize that in every community there's a large voiceless population for whom the official spokespeople are just not representative and are craving some kind of outlet. And those are the people in our communities that I think we need to be reaching. And I suspect that's not only the case for the Jewish community.
Let me pick up a little bit on this question about silos. It strikes me that, and several of you have alluded to this, that silos are also the place where we find the values and the encouragement to continue the work of activism. In other words, there are values there that sustain us, as well as the interfaith connections and the broader values of solidarity. There's a lot of activism on this panel for many, many years, and a lot of prices paid. What personally sustains you in hopefulness and in continued action toward really daunting challenges? I mean, what are the things that you draw from in your own journey that sustain you?
Well, for me, it's really never been much of anything that I've really had to question or think about. I mean, as a Palestinian, you're sort of born into this issue, and I was literally, born into it there. And as someone who not only was born there, but has family throughout the entirety of Palestine, as someone who also has Israeli citizenship, as someone who also grew up in the United States, I was able to really look at the issue through a variety of different lenses. It became clear to me very early on that this is part and parcel of who I was, and not something that I could avoid. I mean, it happens to be that I work in this issue, and I love working in this issue, and that's great. But if I wasn't working in this issue during the work week, I'd be working on this issue when not during the work week as well. I tell people often, I go home from work, from the office. That doesn't mean I stop being a Palestinian. So it's a nonstop sort of effort, and it's because this is, really you're born into it. And I think if any Palestinian in this room or elsewhere knows exactly what I'm talking about. Was Aristotle that said man is born a political animal, right? Palestinians are particularly born as political animals from the very beginning. So for me, it's never something I've had to really think about very much.
Yeah, very, very similar to Youssef. I was born and raised in the South Bronx, and this was a time when there was a lot of police corruption in the South Bronx, a lot of abuse of power. All the radical organizations were being infiltrated by the FBI and being destroyed, and in comes the drug gangs. And oftentimes the drug gangs and the police worked hand in hand. So I was, and also as a young man, as a teenager, I had the crap beaten out of me by the police for just being a Latino male in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I didn't need to study any political tracks on racism or political oppression. I lived it. And I became involved politically because it's what made sense to me, partly for survival, partly because perhaps there was something within me that wanted to see a bigger picture. In my days of student activism, I mentioned that I was involved in the struggle against apartheid South Africa, supporting national liberation movements in Central America and Latin America. I also was able to do some undergraduate archaeological work in Guatemala in 1979. And if you didn't know, 1979 in Guatemala was extremely dangerous. The UN called it a genocide. And I did not learn until perhaps 3 years later, when I returned to the United States, that the U.S. Congress forbade the U.S. from giving Guatemala any military aid or training since 1976 because of gross and consistent human rights violations. In steps in Israel, and by 1982, Israel provides 80% of all military aid, training, and intelligence to the right-wing Guatemalan dictatorships. At the time, the UN called it a genocide. So, you know, there was direct connections already established that, that propelled me to get involved in the struggle for Palestinian self-determination. I know sometimes the question of what inspired you or what transformed you to get involved is a question that excites some people, but I often see that as a question for allies. How did you get involved in my struggle? Which I thank you, I think it's great, and I want to do more of it, but as Yusef said, I was born in it, and I lived through it to this very day.
Yeah, so ditto, actually, to what Gabe and Yusef has said. And of course, I mean, a variety of experiences over, you know, several decades bring you deeper and deeper into it. But living life as a black person in this country and having your eyes open at least enough to see the suffering that goes on, not just in your own communities, but in other communities, both domestically and internationally, keeps you engaged. You just have no way of escaping it. Maybe some people do, but it's not been possible for us. And I think the other thing is organization. Again, from a generation where belonging to an organization is important, you know, whatever it is, but not operating. Now that's a silo problem, Miriam, when you work by yourself. But working in conjunction with people who are like-minded is important, and you know, having a family that's supportive and those kinds of things. But I think, you know, like everyone else, there are moments when you're like, man, what the hell, you know, what's going on? And then there's Ferguson. You know, and you know, people have alluded to these signs of solidarity. You know, the instructions on tear gas, those kinds of things, and also the sign, which was so powerful, of Mike Brown. Mike Brown's life mattered. Muhammad Abu Qadir's life mattered. And bringing those together. That's it. And I mean, again, Ferguson, it's the young people in the street. They're not looking for Jesse or Sharpton or any of those people. Okay, it's a new generation that has no fear. They're getting clear ideologically. They will as time goes on, but they're fearless. They're shutting down freeways in Chicago, in Atlanta, and every place else, and they're building a movement that's important. So, you know, with my own experience of a few decades and seeing this new movement is certainly makes us have hope and want to continue in the fight.
I just want to comment on silos. I think we really framed it, Jamu, we framed it more in terms of time, that people are really properly invested in local struggle, and how do we create the time, like we're doing today, to make those important connections. So I think we didn't want silos to be exclusive, because we know people who are working in the environmental movement, for example. We know people who are working in the workers' rights, in Raise Up, in the farm workers, and they're drowning in the struggles and time and giving time commitments. So I think it was how to take these struggles that we've done today, I think, and really putting the conversation together. And I would argue that the kind of conversation I'm so pleased today that we've begun to put together is exactly the kind of conversation that will open up this kind of analysis. And I do want to recognize that Manzur Chima, sitting right over there, stand up, Muslims for Social Justice, one of our sponsors. But it's important, is this working? Yes. But it's important to note that we're doing audio and video of this event so we can continue this conversation in our local communities to make those kind of interconnections that this whole event is framed around. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think in addition to talking about it, the answer, the main answer is organizing, as it ever was. You know, that when we are planning a protest or a demonstration, that we get our folks out and prevail upon the connections that we've built, so that the people who we've been going to the immigrant detention center vigil on a monthly basis, we will bring to the Free Palestine March on Michigan Avenue. You know, that it's all part of the same struggle. The answer is doing just the grunt work organizing that it's going to take to really build this movement beyond simply talking about it. You know, I feel like I feel a little bit like the odd one out in this last question that was being discussed in a kind of an interesting way, though. Raised as a Jew, I can't deny that my family and people's persecution was always a major part of my own consciousness. I mean, my parents were children during the Holocaust, and I grew up with these stories. I have family members, European family members, who died in Europe, and I'll never forget a story that my mother told me when she was a little girl and was going to the movies and saw newsreel footage when they used to show newsreels before the movie. She was just going to see some little musical or something, and they showed the camps being opened up and the bodies stacked. And she saw this and ran screaming home to her mother, screaming, "Is this going to happen to us?" And that was an indelible part of her own Jewish sense of who she was. And by sharing that story with me, I think it's had that kind of effect on me, that there's this notion that you're part of a people whose legacy is persecution. And from a very early age, the lesson that you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. You do not persecute the strangers because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. I mean, that's part of the solidarity question, Gabe, that I think the solidarity is built into the fabric of our spiritual tradition, that what was done to you, you must never do to another, because you use your own experience of pain as a tool for empathy. And that's something I've always carried with me. I think it's been painful for me, because part of my Jewish narrative growing up, as I said before, was this liberation story of Zionism, and only in my adult years really coming face to face with the reality that what was sold to me as my liberation narrative was actually a narration of my persecution of others, is something I've had to reckon with and come to grips with. And in an odd kind of way, I think that gives me strength and determination that I want, on some level, to make up for that lost time. I want to what, like the Torah says, to take my own Jewish legacy and use that, especially when it's being done in my name as a Jew by a so-called Jewish state, to others. That gives me a tremendous amount of motivation.
Yeah, we're going to close this part, and we have an extraordinary surprise. Deeply felt. I'm really proud to introduce the Raging Grannies, who have done a wonderful song, Ode to Gaza. I would like you all just to take a breath, stand in place, don't leave, as I ask Grannies to come to the front.
We weep for the Gaza sisters, and we ask for your forgiveness. For our tax dollars supply the missiles that kill your children and burn your cities. We weep for the Gaza brothers. You you fought to protect your homeland. Your groves have perished, ancestral homes gone, and still you struggle to keep your birthright. We weep for the Gaza children. The blue skies rain terror upon you. There's no safe haven, no place to run to. Your parents taken by brutal forces. One day the world will awaken to your plight and your cries for justice. And those who forced you into your prison will stop the terror, and peace will blossom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Everyone. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Once more. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom.
Nice work, Yara. Thank you.